He was 61 years old, and his brothers had cleaned out the family farm in a single weekend, and what they left him was the farmhouse itself. The rotting one. The one with the collapsed porch and the broken well and the deed nobody wanted. Because nobody thought it was worth taking. Thomas Garrett walked into that farmhouse in March with $17 in his wallet and a sleeping bag over his shoulder, and he did not know yet that the old well out back, the one sealed with a concrete cap since 1967, was the only place on the property his brothers had not thought to look. What Thomas found when he finally pried that cover loose would take him 4 months to fully understand, and what it told him about his father, a quiet man the world had mostly forgotten, would turn out to be the truest thing he had ever learned about his own life. If you have ever been the one left behind when everything was divided up, this story is for you. Subscribe to this channel if stories like this one mean something to you. There is a button right there, and it costs nothing. And leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from tonight. We read every single one, and it matters more than you know. Thomas Garrett was born in 1962 in Hester County, Indiana, the youngest of 3 brothers on a farm that had been in the family since his grandfather's time. The farm was not large, 114 acres, a quarter of it wooded, the rest in corn and soybeans. But it was paid off, and it was their own, and Thomas had grown up understanding that those 2 things together were not a small thing. His father, Earl Garrett, was a man of the old school in the best sense of the phrase. He worked without complaint, kept his word, and understood that a piece of land was not just something you owned, but something you were responsible for. The way you are responsible for anything left in your care. Earl's 2 older sons, David and Mitchell, had left the farm in their 20s. David went to Indianapolis and got into insurance and did well at it in the way that produces a certain kind of confidence, the kind that fills a room slightly before its owner enters. Mitchell went south to Evansville and worked in manufacturing for years and eventually managed a plant and sent Christmas cards with photographs of his family in matching outfits. They were not bad men. Thomas would have said that, if asked, and meant it. They were men who had found their lives elsewhere and who thought of the farm. When they thought of it at all, the way you think of a childhood bedroom, fondly, distantly, and without any particular intention to go back. Thomas had stayed. He had not stayed out of obligation, though obligation was part of it. He had stayed because the work suited him, and because the land suited him, and because his father's company suited him, and he had found, in his 20s and 30s, that there was a kind of life available to a person who stayed that was not available to a person who left. A life built from accumulated small knowledge, the exact slope of the south field where water collected after a hard rain, the particular sound the barn door made in the wind when it needed a new hinge pin, the way the light fell across the woodlot in October mornings when the maples were fully turned. Earl had a stroke in 2017 and a second one in 2019, and had died in the spring of 2023 at 88, in the same house he had been born in. Thomas had been there. He had been the one who cooked the meals in the last years, and drove Earl to his appointments, and sat with him in the evenings when the television was on, and Earl's mind was sometimes clear, and sometimes not. He had done this without keeping score, because that was not the way he thought about things. It was what needed doing, and he was the one there to do it. The will was read 2 weeks after the funeral. David and Mitchell drove in from Indianapolis and Evansville, and the 3 of them sat in the lawyer's office in Hester and listened. Earl had divided the farm equally among his 3 sons, equally. The land, the equipment, the livestock, the savings, all of it in 3 parts, as if the 37 years Thomas had been on the property had not happened, as if the distinction between the brother who stayed and the brothers who left was not a distinction the will recognized. Thomas had not said anything in the lawyer's office. He had looked at the document and then looked at the window, at a maple tree outside the window, and had thought about what equal meant when applied to a thing that was not equal in the ways that mattered. David called a meeting 3 weeks later and presented a plan. He had spoken to a real estate agent, not the local one, Thomas noticed, but one from Indianapolis, and the farm had been assessed, and there was a buyer, a large agricultural operation out of Ohio that was buying up parcels in Hester County. The offer was serious. David thought they should take it. Mitchell agreed. He had said it simply, in the tone he used when he had already decided something and was reporting the decision rather than discussing it. Makes sense, Thomas. The numbers are good. The farmhouse, it emerged, was the problem. The agricultural operation wanted the land and the equipment and the outbuildings, but the farmhouse was old and soft in several places, and the porch had partly given way. And no one wanted to purchase and then demolish a house with an occupied family member in it. The solution, David said, and he had said it with the particular reasonableness of a man who has thought this through and considers it generous, was that Thomas could have the farmhouse and the half-acre it sat on, deeded to him outright, and his share of the sale proceeds minus the assessed value of the house and lot. The assessed value of the house and lot was $14,000, which was subtracted from Thomas's third. He had the document in his hand. He looked at it for a moment. "You'd be keeping the house," David said. Thomas signed, not because he agreed, because arguing required a different kind of energy than he had available, and because something in him understood, even then, that the farmhouse was not the worst place to be. He moved in on a cold Saturday in March. The porch was soft on the left side, and he stepped around the bad boards out of habit. He had known which boards were bad for years. The interior was intact. 4 rooms downstairs, 2 up, plaster walls that were cracked in places but holding, a cast-iron stove in the kitchen that still worked, a root cellar underneath with a door that stuck, but opened if you lifted and pulled at the same time. He had $17. He had a sleeping bag and a canvas bag with a week's worth of clothes and his tools, which were his own, and which David had to his credit, not contested. He stood in the kitchen his father had cooked in for 60 years and looked at the stove and the window over the sink and the hook by the back door where Earl's hat had hung for as long as Thomas could remember. The hat was gone. David had taken it along with most everything else of value in the weekend before the papers were signed. But the hook was still there. He hung his own hat on it. The nearest neighbor was a woman named Cecily Draves, who farmed the 180 acres to the east, and who had known Earl Garrett for 40 years. She drove over on Thomas's third day with a casserole dish, covered in foil, and the particular directness of a person who does not waste words on preamble. "Your brothers took the good tractor," she said, handing him the dish. "Yes, you've got the old farmall in the shed." "I know. I kept it running." She looked at the farmhouse front. She looked at the porch. "What are you going to do?" "Fix the porch first," Thomas said. "Then the rest." She nodded once, as if this was the correct answer. She said if he needed anything he knew where she was, and she went back to her truck. He found a contractor named Ray Sutter in town. A lean, deliberate man in his 50s who had done work for Earl years ago and who came out on a Wednesday afternoon and walked the house and gave Thomas his honest assessment, which was that the bones were good, Earl had built well and maintained well, and that the porch and the roof over the back bedroom and the kitchen floor in one corner were the 3 things that needed doing before anything else. Ray gave him a number that was fair. Thomas told him he'd need to start with the porch and work from there as the money allowed, which Ray said was how most things got done and was fine by him. Thomas worked alongside Ray's crew on the porch because he was a capable man with his hands and it reduced the labor cost, and because working was better than watching. It was on the second day of the porch work, clearing the debris from under the collapsed section, that he found the first thing. It was a coffee can, sealed with a lid and wrapped in a cloth feed sack, tucked into the space between the foundation stone and the lowest porch board. In a spot that the collapse had exposed, Thomas picked it up and shook it and heard something shift inside, something solid, not coins, not paper. He set it on the porch railing and finished the work for the day, and that evening he opened it. Inside was a small glass jar, the kind Earl had used for storing screws, and inside the jar were 7 arrowheads, old ones. Flint, carefully napped, in good condition. There was also a folded scrap of paper, brittle with age, with Earl's handwriting on it. Backfield, North Fence Row, 1958, mound site. Tell Thomas. He read that last line twice. Tell Thomas, not David, not Mitchell. Thomas, he set the paper down and looked at the arrowheads for a long time. The next morning he walked to the North Fence Row of the backfield, which was not his field anymore, which was the Ohio Agricultural Company's field now, though they hadn't planted it yet, and he looked at the ground along the fence and found what he had always thought was a natural rise in the land, a low swelling of earth about 30 feet across, and understood for the first time that it was not natural at all. If you are still with Thomas tonight, please take one moment and subscribe to this channel, because what came next is the part that changed everything, and we are almost there. Just tap that button and stay with us. Let's go back to that farmhouse. He did not disturb the mound. He was not that kind of man. But he walked back to the farmhouse with something different in his thinking. A sense that his father had known something, had kept something, had been waiting for the right moment to pass it along, and that the moment had come the way his father's moments always came, quietly and without announcement. It was the following week, clearing the old kitchen garden behind the house, that Thomas noticed the well cover was different than he remembered. He had known the well his whole life. A hand-dug well, 30 feet deep, capped with a concrete disc in 1967, when the county water line had reached the property, and Earl had connected to it. The disc was old and mossy, and it always seemed to Thomas like a permanent fixture, as fixed as the ground itself. But looking at it now, he saw that along the south edge, where the concrete met the fieldstone collar, someone had laid a bead of newer mortar, not recent, but newer than 1967, careful work. The kind you do when you want something sealed that was not sealed before, or sealed again after it was opened. He got a pry bar from the shed. The cover lifted on the third try, heavy and awkward, grinding on the stone collar as he worked it to the side. He shone his flashlight down into the shaft. The water table had dropped over the decades, and the well was dry, at least in the upper portion. 8 feet down, set into a niche cut into the stone lining of the shaft, a niche that had been cut deliberately, Thomas could see, the edges too clean to be natural, was a metal box. Green, painted steel, the size of a shoebox, with a hasp and a padlock. He rigged a rope and a loop of chain and brought it up. The padlock was a standard hardware store padlock, the kind sold in 4 sizes. Thomas went through Earl's keys, which he had kept, which nobody had thought to take, and found the right one on the third try. Inside the box, dry and intact, were 3 things. A large envelope, sealed with wax. A smaller envelope, unsealed, with Thomas's name on it in Earl's handwriting. And a roll of film canisters, old ones, 35 memory, 12 of them in a rubber-banded bundle with a note tucked under the band, photographs, backfield, North Fence Row, summer 1961. He opened the small envelope first. It was a letter, 2 pages, written in Earl's steady hand. Not the uncertain hand of his last years, but the firm, deliberate hand of a man in his late 40s, each letter placed with the patience of someone who had been taught that penmanship was a form of respect. Earl had written it in 1989 when Thomas was 27 and had updated it once, in a slightly different pen with a heavier line, with a date of 2004. He began by saying he was not a letter writer, which Thomas knew, and that he was writing this one because there were things Thomas should know that he had never found the right words for out loud, and that written words were sometimes more reliable than spoken ones, because they stayed where you put them. He wrote that he had put it in the well because the well was the one place on the property that had no reason to be opened and everything to gain from being left alone. He said he had sealed it in 1989, after David's last visit, during which David had walked the farmstead with a look in his eye that Earl recognized and did not like. He did not explain this further. He did not need to. He wrote about the mound in the north field. He had found it in 1957 while digging fence post holes, had hit something different 8 inches down, not rock, not root, but compacted earth with a regularity to it that stopped him, and had stood up and looked at the shape of the ground around him and understood what he was standing next to. His own father had talked about mounds. Earl had known what to look for. He had stood in the field for a long time without saying anything to anyone, and then he had put the post-hole digger in the truck and reset the fence line with a gentle outward curve that nobody questioned, because nobody had been looking at it that closely, and he had kept the mound's existence to himself for 32 years at the time he wrote the letter. He had not disturbed it. Not once. He believed it was not his to disturb, the same way he believed a cemetery was not his to disturb. Because some things belong to the people who came before, and to the people who will come after, and the most you can do is not be the one who breaks the chain. In 1961, a man named Howard Stills from the State University had stopped at the farm after noticing the fence line's curve on an aerial survey photograph, and Earl had shown him the mound. And Stills had spent 3 days documenting and photographing, and had gone back to the university and had written about it in a paper that Earl had read once and kept in the large envelope. Stills had honored Earl's request that the paper not identify the exact property. It was in the large envelope. Thomas would see. Earl had not told David or Mitchell about any of this. He wrote this plainly. He had watched both of them and had made his judgment, and his judgment was that they would not leave it alone. This was not a condemnation. It was an accounting. The same kind of accounting he applied to soil condition and weather and the reliability of equipment. He had watched his sons, and he knew what he saw. By 2004, when he came back to the letter, he knew who to tell. He had watched Thomas work the land for 37 years by then, and he wrote, "You see it the way I see it. Not as something you own, as something you are responsible for. You will know what to do with this." Below that, in the same pen, Professor Stills died in 1992, but his work is at Purdue. There may be something in this for you, Thomas. Not the kind of thing David would recognize as value. The right kind. Thomas read the letter twice. He set it on the table and looked out the window at the hook by the back door, his hat hanging where his father's hat had hung, and at the window over the sink where the light came in at the angle that only happened in late May. And he had known this light for 60 years without once asking himself what it meant to have known it, and now he asked. And the answer was large enough that it took some time to finish arriving. He drove to Purdue the following month. He brought the large envelope, which contained Professor Stills' paper and 40 years of Earl's careful notes on the mound. Dates, observations, brief penciled sketches of the fence line and the surrounding soil in different seasons, small observations like a good field journal. The kind of record a man keeps not because anyone told him to, but because he understood the importance of what he was watching. and the roll of film, which he had developed at a shop in Indianapolis before the trip, because he had not wanted to open that box at a drugstore counter. The photographs were remarkable. 12 images of the mound in 1961, before 60 years of agricultural pressure and weather had softened its edges into the landscape, clear and unmistakable even to Thomas's untrained eye, a deliberate earthwork, symmetrical, substantial. He had called ahead. The archaeology department's receptionist had connected him to a graduate student who had taken a message and, apparently, passed it along with some urgency. Because when Thomas arrived, the person waiting to meet him was not a graduate student, but a professor. Dr. Anita Kurz was a compact woman in her mid-40s, with reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and the efficient manner of someone whose time is genuinely scarce, and who has chosen to spend some of it on Thomas Garrett anyway, which told him something. She took the envelope and spread the contents on a worktable, and read Earl's notes slowly, the way a person reads something when they are paying attention, and she looked at the photographs one by one and set each one down carefully before picking up the next. She was quiet for a long time when she finished. "Your father kept this site intact for 65 years, she said. "Yes, without telling anyone. He told me." Eventually, she looked up from the photographs. She had the particular expression of someone deciding whether what they are looking at is luck or something more intentional. She decided on something more intentional. "There are preservation grants," she said, "for sites like this, when a private landowner has maintained them without disturbance. We would need to do a full assessment first, but from what you've shown me," she stopped. She looked at the photograph of the mound in its 1961 clarity. "This is an extraordinary piece of stewardship, Mr. Garrett." "It was his," Thomas said. "I'm just the one who found the letter." The site assessment ran most of the summer. Dr. Kurz brought a team of 4 graduate students in June, and they worked alongside Thomas on the North Field for 2 weeks, taking soil samples and ground-penetrating radar readings and GPS measurements along the fence line. The Ohio Agricultural Company had planted corn on most of the parcel by then, but the mound and the 20-foot buffer around it sat in a small, unmowed island amid the rows, exactly as Earl's fence line had always preserved it, and the team was careful and respectful, and left the site exactly as they had found it. The assessment confirmed what Earl had suspected in 1957 and what Professor Stills had documented in 1961. A Hopewell mortuary complex of significant regional importance, one of the better preserved examples in Indiana, maintained in its condition entirely because one man had run his fence line in a gentle curve for 60 years and kept his own counsel about why. Dr. Kurz came back herself in August, without her team, and spent a day with Thomas walking the property and talking about Earl. Not about the site's academic significance, she had colleagues for that, but about Earl as a person, what Thomas knew of him, what kind of man he had been. Thomas told her about the mornings, about Earl's way of working, about the way he had always seemed to understand the land as something that had claims on him, rather than the other way around. Dr. Kurz listened with the attention of someone who is storing the information carefully. At the end of the day, standing at the edge of the mound, she said, "The university is going to want to do something to honor what he did. A named stewardship recognition." At minimum, Thomas was quiet for a moment. He wouldn't have wanted the attention, he said. "No," she said. "But he'd have wanted the site to last." She looked at the mound. "This is one way to make sure it does." The preservation grant came through in September. It was substantial, not the kind of money that changes a person into someone different, but the kind that removes the daily arithmetic of survival and replaces it with something resembling room to breathe. It came to Thomas because the site was on his land, the half-acre that nobody had wanted, and because Purdue's grant application had named him as the site custodian, because that was what he was and what he intended to remain. David heard about it in October. Thomas did not tell him. Dr. Kurz had presented at a regional archaeology conference in Columbus, and a brief item about the Garrett site had appeared in a regional newspaper, and David, who followed these things more carefully than most people knew, had seen it. He called on a Wednesday evening. "There's an archaeology thing on the old property," David said. "I saw something about it." "Yes, and you're involved somehow." "It's on my land," Thomas said. "The half-acre." A silence. The particular kind. Dad knew about this? He did. Another silence. Thomas could hear David processing the arithmetic of it. "And you knew I found out in March." A very long silence. "Is there money in this?" "There's a grant," Thomas said. "For site preservation." "Well," a pause. "That's another pause. Is there anything we should know?" Thomas said. "There isn't." He said it without heat. He said it the way you state a fact. And he moved on. And that was that. Mitchell did not call. Thomas had not expected him to. Cecily Draves came over when she heard. She stood in the kitchen and listened while Thomas showed her the photographs, the 1961 ones, the mound in its original clarity, and when she had looked at all of them, she set the last one down on the table and was quiet for a moment. "Your father never said a word," she said. "No, 40 years of plowing around that fence line. I always thought it was just how he'd said it. So did everyone." She looked at the photograph again. "He trusted you with it." "Eventually," Thomas said. She came back the following Tuesday with a meal, the same way she had come in March, and she said she'd be glad to help with the documentation work if Dr. Kurz's team needed local knowledge of the land and its history. Thomas said he'd pass that along. He did, and Dr. Kurz took Cecily up on it, and Cecily spent 3 weeks that fall walking the fields with the university team, and providing the kind of on-the-ground knowledge that only comes from 40 years of farming adjacent land. She did it without being asked twice, and without asking anything in return, which Thomas recognized as the same instinct Earl had always operated from, and which he had started, quietly, to operate from himself. He fixed the porch. He fixed the roof over the back bedroom. He fixed the kitchen floor. He fixed what needed fixing, in the order it needed fixing, and the farmhouse became, over the course of that first year, a place that was sound again. Not new. Sound, there is a difference, and Thomas understood it, and he preferred it. His father had built this house to last, and had maintained it to last, and what it needed was not renovation, but attention, and attention was something Thomas had always known how to give. He planted the kitchen garden the following spring, in the same beds Earl had planted for 50 years, using seeds from a tin he found in the root cellar, labeled in Earl's handwriting. The year of each variety written on the paper packet inside, some of them going back 15 years, saved and relabeled faithfully, the way Earl saved and relabeled everything he intended to keep. The tomatoes came up true. The beans came up true. In August, before the first hard heat broke, he left a bag of vegetables on Cecily's gatepost without knocking, because that was how Earl had always done it and it was the right way, and he walked back down the road with his hands in his pockets the way Earl had walked, and did not look back. She left a note on his gatepost the next morning that said simply, "Same time next year." He was 61 years old, and his brothers had taken everything worth taking and left him the farmhouse that nobody wanted, and he had walked in with $17 and a sleeping bag, and had not known yet what his father had been keeping for him. That is how this story began. What he had, in the end, was not what anyone would have predicted: a piece of land with a mound in it that a man had spent 60 years quietly protecting. and a letter in a well that said the right person would know what to do, and the understanding that some inheritances are not divided into equal shares and are not supposed to be. Some things can only go to the one who stayed, not because the others were wrong, or lesser, or undeserving, but because staying is its own kind of knowing, and what you know is what you are trusted with. And what you are trusted with is what becomes yours, not by document or division, but by the slow, daily fact of being there. Earl Garrett understood this. He spent 60 years proving it with a fence line and a sealed well, and a letter addressed to one son out of 3. And he was right about which one. He is 64 now. The mound is intact and documented and protected, and Dr. Kurz's team comes every other year to monitor and assess. The farmhouse is sound. The kitchen garden is planted every May. And on the hook by the back door, in the same spot it has always hung, is his hat. Earl's hook. Thomas's hat. In a house that belongs to him now, in every sense of the word. If this story reached you tonight, please subscribe to this channel and share it with someone you think needs to hear it. And before you go, tell us something in the comments. Have you ever been trusted with something by someone who is gone? Something they believed you would know how to carry? We would be honored to hear about it. Those stories deserve to be told. Thank you for being here. See you in the next one.